Our topic is the influence of the philosopher Plato on Christian thought, or what Christian theologians have made of Plato's ideas. The man himself lived in Athens in ancient Greece. He was born in 428 BC and died in 348 BC. The stature of Plato, widely speaking, can hardly be in doubt. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead said that the entire history of Western philosophy could be characterised as a series of footnotes on Plato. And many have claimed that he is the first philosopher in the sense that we use the word today. Philosophy goes back to Plato. Plato's thought might be considered important for all sorts of reasons. He wrote about ethics, for instance, and politics, and the nature of knowledge or epistemology. But it is perhaps his theory of the forms that lies at the heart of the Christian interest in his work. Plato proposed that behind the world that we can see, with all its characteristics and its objects, was a transcendent realm of what he called the forms, which were the truest of all realities. So when we encounter justice in the world, for instance, he thought that that was a certain sort of copy or shining forth of eternal justice, or the form of justice. Similarly, beauty in the world was a glimpse of the form of beauty, or goodness of the form of the good. He went further and said that even material objects like a tree is some instantiation of the true and ideal tree, or even that when carpenters make a bed, they are somehow, perhaps unwittingly, consulting the true form of the bed, which lies somewhere in this realm of the truest beings. What's important about this for Christian theology is the sense of a transcendent reference to the world, that somehow the world comes from somewhere, that it embodies something, that it shows something forth, that it has a meaning, it has truth, which comes to it from beyond. Now, Plato's theory of the forms presented many challenges to Christian theologians, and we'll come back to that later, but this idea of a transcendent origin and reference for the world was what lies at the heart of why they valued his thought so much. This was often expressed in terms of a word, participation, taken from a very Platonic vocabulary. This was the idea that everything exists as a sort of gift from God, a sort of donation, that the existence of anything, for instance, is some sharing from God of God's perfect existence. Or we might consider that tree, that everything about it, its strength, its beauty, its life, are all in a way a sharing from God of these perfections in God's own life. So thinking about it from God to the world, we can think about it as a sharing or a donation. Thinking about it from the side of the creature, as it were, we can talk about it in terms of participation, that the tree's life and beauty and strength and its very being are a participation in God and those qualities in God. One of the great theorists of this in the Christian tradition is Augustine of Hippo, and he particularly liked a verse which we find towards the beginning of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where he asks them, "What do you have that you did not receive?" And Augustine saw this as a question that could be pressed very, very far back, that we could ask about anything in the world, its very existence and all of its qualities. What do you have that you did not receive? Now the challenge here is to hold in tension two different truths that the Christian faith wants to uphold. On the one hand, that God is the absolute origin and that everything about everything comes from God. We'll come to the question of evil there in a little while. But at the same time, we want to say that we're not pantheists and that there is some utter distinction between the world and God. And in formulating an account of how participation works like this, that's the challenge, to say that everything about everything comes from God, and yet at the same time to make this absolute distinction between God and his creatures. We've begun to talk about some of the content of Plato's thought that might have been significant for later thinkers, Christians among others. But there's also the question of how he wrote, which was consistently in the dialogue form. That's to say that his writings don't look like essays, they look like play scripts. Often the figure of Socrates is prominent, and he finds himself in some sort of social gathering, and various other characters ask him questions, and he asks questions in return. We sometimes call this the Socratic method of getting to the truth through asking and answering questions. So Plato writes in this dialogue form with to and fro and with questions. And this was to prove important from time to time in later writing. I might think of some of the earlier dialogues of Augustine, for instance, just after his conversion, or St Aelred of Rievaulx wrote his book on spiritual friendship in this form. Now, we would be wrong to say here that in either of those cases there was necessarily a direct influence of Plato, but we can say that Plato was the great instigator of the dialogue form, of this to and fro, and that this was taken up perhaps in rather a diffuse form and without necessarily a direct influence time and time again in later writing. So there's the way in which Plato looks on the page, and that's certainly important, but there's another principle at work here which in some ways is even more important for Christian practice and spirituality, and that's the idea that the truth is sought best when it's sought together. Plato gives us in this dialogue form and in the details of his own life and in the life of Socrates, his great teacher, this sense that we seek the truth best together in the form of a friendship. In fact, he would say that the characteristic of the highest form of friendship was this communal search together after truth. And he presents us with really a very compelling image where truth and beauty and goodness and being are all interwoven. So we might say that there's almost something of the love story to this search for the truth. There's an element of desire to it, because the truth is good and good is beautiful, and this draws us on. We might think of, paradoxically, one of the few documents that's come down to us with Plato's name on it that isn't a dialogue, the so-called seventh letter. We can be pretty certain that most of the other letters are not by him, and the authorship of the seventh letter is slightly in question, but it's certainly very typically Platonic in its themes. And there he talks about the search for truth as an act of friendship and a common project. After long partnership in common life, devoted to this very thing, that's seeking together, does truth flash upon the soul like a flame kindled by a leaping spark, and once it is born, there it nourishes itself thereafter. It's a common, very much religious, spiritual search for the truth by common conversations and by a sort of purification of the life. And if we were to search subsequent literature, we would probably find nowhere where that spirit is more perfectly exemplified than a passage in Augustine's Confessions, where he talks about a conversation he had with his mother, Monica, sitting near a window in a house in the port town of Ostia, near Rome. And there, he says, they have a conversation, and as their thoughts mount with this to and fro, eventually they're accorded by God a vision of eternity. There's no reason to suppose that Augustine had that passage of Plato in his mind when he wrote of that vision, but there's something very deeply Platonic about this sense of a common search after truth through a process of dialogue and discussion. Platonism has a history. We might speak of the first phase as being the life and thought of Plato himself, and then as that's taken up by his immediate successors. But then we reach what's often called MiddlePlatonism, which stretches from the 1st century BC into the 3rd century AD. And this is important for our purposes because it's Platonism in this form that forms something of the philosophical background of early Christian thought and mission. Middle Platonism is represented by figures such as Plutarch and Numenius. It was, in fact, rather a loose connection of thoughts and philosophical approaches, certainly very much inspired by Plato, but beginning to take in aspects of Neo-Pythagorean thought and of Aristotle. It's defined by its reaction to other things that were happening in philosophy at the time, particularly a sort of skepticism and growing sense of atheism. So in this sense, it had aspects that were in keeping with a Christian attitude towards the world. It respected the idea of revelation, for instance. It was very enthusiastic about this idea of a transcendent origin and reference for the world and the importance of spiritual practices. Certainly we wouldn't expect to find developed Christian doctrines there, and we don't find them, but rather as a Christian today might, in the face of atheism, think that he or she and members of another religion were at least on the same page, we could perhaps say the same for MiddlePlatonism and Christians in respect of that more sceptical philosophy that was around at the time. The earliest Christian responses to this sort of Platonic philosophy run the whole gamut of reactions. On the one hand, we find something of agitation. We find some of the earliest fathers saying that they recognise so many similarities between their outlook and that of Plato that Christians risk being accused of having copied what they're saying from Plato, and as I say, they often put that with something of agitation. On the other hand, there was also a great deal of respect. We might single out in particular two aspects of Platonism that went down rather well. And one was a sense that the world was God's creation. That is not unproblematic in Platonism, and we'll get to where the problems might lie later on. But they did encounter in one of the dialogues called the Timaeus the idea of the demiurge, who may be a lesser sort of God, but is at least presented as a sort of creator. And they also, these early Christians, liked the idea in Platonism of the utter transcendence of God. They liked the sense that one was talking here not about some pagan anthropomorphic God, but as of the God who lay behind all things and was difficult to speak about. One couldn't be easily domesticated within any human scheme. There was a particular passage in the Timaeus for that reason, for both of these reasons, that drew particular respect. Now, to discover the maker and father of the universe were a task indeed, and having discovered him, to declare him unto others were a thing impossible. We also come across claims of copying. That's another way of reacting to this danger that they might be seen to be saying too much the same thing. So the claim is not at all uncommon that Plato must have copied from Moses. In fact, among the fathers, you get quite a discussion of how it could have been that Plato knew Moses. The idea, perhaps, that when the Jews were in exile, Plato had come across the writings of Moses. So we've spoken a little bit about Middle Platonism as part of the philosophical background of those very early Christian writers. The next stage of Platonism, and one that has been incredibly important for later Christian thought, is often called Neoplatonism. Sometimes the beginning of this movement is put down to rather an elusive figure called Ammonius Saccas in the 3rd century AD, who didn't leave any writings, or one of his followers, Plotinus, who left quite an extensive collection of writings, although in rather a jumbled state. A definitive feature of Neoplatonism is rather an elaborate metaphysical scheme, with a divine source at its most inaccessible